What if a haunted house just got up and walked away, stood on 2 feet and went, "See ya," and it also had a bunch of other ghosts inside? Sounds like a nightmare, but then the whole thing is pink and blue and colorful, and there's a ghost with a horseshoe face? Now it sounds like an acid trip. Throw in some punk teenagers and you might just have the recipe for homesick pilots. Hello and welcome to Looking for the Best, a comic quest. My name is Danny, and on this show I search for the best of the best comics, graphic novels, webtoons, and more. And I ask the very important question, can I fill my shelves with greatness? On today's episode, I am diving into another indie series called Homesick Pilots. This comic is actually, hilariously and coincidentally, a similar color palette to the previous episode about Lore Olympus, and you can tell that just by looking at the cover, where you'll see more of that bright pink and deep blue. But I swear, it's not just blue man and pink woman. Once again, it's a totally different art style, different story entirely. Just a interesting coincidence, I guess. And funny though how it went from an alien superhero from outer space in episode 1 to dead gods in outer space in episode 2, to not dead gods in pink and blue in episode 3, and now to pink and blue teenagers in a haunted house for episode 4. This was not an intentional pattern. I didn't plan this out, not at all, but here we are, I guess. Before I really start getting too much into it, though, here's a quick content warning. This book does feature drug use, violence, gore, it's stylized, but still gore, suicide, death, mental health issues, and various other adult themes. It is officially rated M for mature by whoever rates comic books. Is it the publisher? It seems like the publisher. It's rated M. I personally don't think there's all that much of any of this. Yes, it's there, and it's absolutely easy to find in every issue. It's just not as in your face on every single page like some of these mature comics can be. I'm not exactly sure how to calculate the precise amount of adult stuff in here, because sometimes it's just undertones, or maybe they talk about it without showing it, but the really hardcore, gross, or explicit death and violence is only a few pages or panels now and again, and sometimes those details are somewhat hidden. The drug use is minimal, plenty of cigarettes though, but like one single bong moment, and otherwise I didn't see a whole lot else in terms of drug use, but it's there a little bit. The suicide is in issue 2, and it's not a main character, but I just wanted to let you know that that does happen. Generally, I don't think this is that tough to read, but that's for everyone to judge on their own, whatever you feel comfortable with. Alright, so, pink and blue teenagers. Don't worry, there's more color in there than just those two, but first let's go over the story. Homesick Pilots. Odd title, isn't it? Not really a good representation of what the story is actually about, nor does it invite much intrigue, at least not to me. Instead, it just made me go, what? But there is a reason for the name, which is primarily that it is the name of the main character's band. Band, you say? Band? Music? What? You betcha! Band, music. The main character is a teenage girl named Amy, and she's the lead singer of her high school punk band. She's a foster kid, an outcast, a troubled teen, if you will. While I don't think it was explicitly mentioned in this volume, the author, Dan Waters, has said in an interview with the Comic Crush that she is supposed to be 17 years old. The story is set in the summer of 1994 in the fictional town of Santa Manos, California, which is basically a beach town that looks a lot like Santa Monica, California, and has plenty of, pop-punk influences and beachside scenes, and there's the ocean, and also a Ferris wheel and streets where kids can skateboard, and 90s Santa Monica basically is what they're going for, but it's called Santa Manos, or Santa Manos, which means Saint Hands in Spanish. Amy and her 2 buddies, Rip and Buzz, great names, very 90s, love it. They're also fellow outcasts just like her. They all make up the band Homesick Pilots. I don't know if they get into why they named the band this in later issues, but it seems to be a reference to the fact that none of the kids have their birth parents in their lives. They feel alone, but together alone. missing what they can no longer have and struggling to steer themselves forward. They're homesick pilots, kind of. This is pure conjecture, though, because we have a rare instance of me not having read ahead in advance. Whoa, oh my god, bananas, I know. I can't believe it. I only know what happens in this volume. That's it. There are 2 more volumes after this, 5 issues apiece, so 15 issues total, and the publisher has said that Volume 3 is indeed the last one. Each of the volumes also has a subtitle, which I feel should be done way more often because it's really fun and I liked it a lot. Volume 1 is subtitled Teenage Haunts. Volume 2 is subtitled I Wanna Be a Walking Weapon. And Volume 3 is subtitled 3 Chords and the End of the World. See what I mean? Way more fun. That makes it sound like so much better. I know bigger comics will do this, like you can have 100 Spider-Man or Batman or whatever comics and they have to have their subtitles so you don't just have Spider-Man a million times over and over again. But I don't see it as much in indie comics, and I think it'd be fun if more of them had these kind of subtitles. Is that what they're even called? I think they're subtitles. That's what I'm going with anyway. All right, time to summarize Volume 1, Teenage Haunts. And just a heads up, I will be spoiling a couple of things from the first few issues. I won't be spoiling the whole volume and how it ends, but I will be giving you more information than what you get in just issue 1, and more information than I typically give you in these episodes in general. Okay? Okay. So, let's get started. We begin the story rather ominously with scenes of an old, worn-down house. No, I feel like I'm not being dramatic enough for me having said ominously. Let me try again. Ready? We begin this story ominously with scenes of an old, worn-down house that goes from looking like a house to turning into a Power Rangers Megazord or anime mecha or something. In other words, just a big old thing that was something else, but now it's this big thing with arms and legs that's ready to fight somehow, I guess. This is a huge multi-story house that can walk and stuff. Amy is inside the house, and she tells us that she is speaking with ghosts. And it all looks incredibly dangerous with some spooky undertones. Cut to a few weeks earlier when Amy and her friends are at a rival band's gig, which eventually gets broken up by the cops. This rival band is called the Nuclear Bastards. Even more very 90s names. I love it. So they're watching these rivals that they don't like, and Amy's feeling very competitive. So she says, and I quote, "We should throw a gig in the house that kills people." What? Well, that's intense and very dramatic. I mean, who says shit like this? A teenager, that's who. Teenagers say shit like this. Because Amy wants to throw a sicker gig than those wannabes. Sometimes reading the slang makes me want to go like, dude, let's catch some gnarly waves, or take a chill pill, bruh. So anyway, the cops come, they run off, and later end up on a pier. Is it Santa Monica Pier? Maybe, just a little bit, looks like it. While hanging out, they discuss Amy's idea of performing at the house, which is actually called the Old James House. And Buzz brings up how a fellow foster kid actually died there. Can't have a haunted house without a scary story that may or may not be true. And also can't have a haunted house without an official name that is typically very pretentious. Did Old James name his house after himself? Or was it once called the James House, and then he got older and everybody in town started calling it the Old James House? A little bit of a dig, isn't it? Another entry for my list of questions that I'm curious about that I probably won't ever get an answer to. On the definitely not Santa Monica Pier, they run into the Nuclear Bastards, who also ran from the cops, and both sides are arguing and say some derogatory shit about each other, and, we don't like you, and we don't like you. And the bastards upset Amy in particular, making her feel bad about herself, and we find out that she's always getting berated, looked down on, called names, treated poorly. And so after this encounter, feeling terrible, she decides, you know what? I'm gonna go to the house. So that's what she does. And she doesn't leave. Amy is now missing. Gasp! And her friends, particularly Buzz, are worried about her. They go to the house to look for her, run into the Nuclear Bastards again, who have also broken in, and it ends very, very violently. With some actual death, like people die in issue 1. After struggling to get out because the house is coming alive and changing the corridors around and making some crazy carnival funhouse thing happen, Buzz and Rip do eventually escape. So where's Amy? Well, she's not actually at the house at all. Instead, she's floating outside some random tall building looking for a haunted horseshoe. And we learn, again I quote, "The horrors do not leave the house, unless, of course, the horrors are stolen. The house would very much like its ghosts back." Dun dun dun! Ooh boy, what a start. That's the general plot of the first issue. I waited to add most of my fun commentary until now, though, because I didn't want to confuse you with too much information, so I waited, okay, that was the plot. But finally, here are some of my initial thoughts. And by the way, I took a lot of notes for this book. Like, a lot. Alright, first, this story has some very funny moments. It's by no means a comedy, not at all, but it can get meta at times in a very entertaining way. It actually reminds me a little bit of Buffy the Vampire Slayer type of humor. Very dry, very blunt, very honest. For example, when the homesick pilots are at the Nuclear Bastards gig, I will never get tired of saying that kind of sentence. They're at the Nuclear Bastards gig, we see a speech bubble over the lead singer of the Nuclear Bastards, and where normally there might be some lyrics in the speech bubble, or some music notes to signify that he's singing, or really anything in the speech bubble, it instead says, in parentheses, some shitty derivative trash shit. Oh man, some shitty derivative trash shit. That's what they wrote. He's not singing anything of any importance, apparently, which is hella funny, in my opinion. Also in the first issue, we see my favorite 2 pages of the whole story so far. Now, the pages aren't numbered like regular books, so I can't tell you exactly where it is, but it's maybe 18 to 20 pages into the first issue, and it's a 2-page spread of the inside layout of the old James house. It's not a blueprint, but more like if you were to take the whole building and slice it in half from the front door to the back door. You can see all of the rooms, with each panel being a different room, and you can see the stairs to get to those rooms and the characters as they talk to each other and move around. Rip and Buzz are trying to get inside to look for Amy, but they go to the front door, which is locked, so they decide to climb through a 3rd-story window, and this is at the top left of the left-hand page. And then in the bottom right of the right-hand page are the Nuclear Bastards entering the same home from the 1st-floor kitchen window at the back of the house. So you see all these characters enter and then go through the house, up or downstairs, depending on where they are, only to meet in the middle on the 2nd floor in the center room. It's a little trippy to see and a little hard to describe because you have to follow the story from different starting points, and it's like this time-bending face-off type thing that is... It's very cool. It's a really neat effect. I've never seen anyone do anything like this. Granted, I have not read all that many comics, but I still think it was very inventive and made for a super neat effect. It's actually revisited again at the end of issue 4, but the house does not look the same. We saw the version the house wanted us to see in issue 1, but in issue 4, you really see what it's been hiding. Again, as a 2-page spread, and just a really awesome idea. And the last thing I want to mention before circling back to the plot are the narrative devices that are used to move the story along. Really, we're just going to talk about one of them, which is the most obvious one, and that is the use of the black pages. Every so often in each issue, there is a fully blacked out page with a few sentences or less in white text. The text is first-person narration, so, I did this happened to me, and it's all from our protagonist, Amy. But I would argue it's also somewhat omniscient, or more likely even a future version of Amy, as this narrator knows much more than the current version of Amy that we're reading about. Think of it like a narrator that is writing the book of their life that they've already lived. It's their book and their life, so they can add in additional commentary via these short asides that inform the audience of something without directly affecting what's going on, because it already happened. It gives us insight as to what's happening, how Amy is feeling, or what she's thinking in certain moments, and occasionally she is speaking directly to the audience as if knowing that we're reading. She doesn't appear to be an unreliable narrator, though, which is another thing that can happen. I trust what the narrator is telling me, future Amy, but I also think that maybe it could be somewhat omniscient, because omniscient narration means an all-knowing narrator. While a future version of Amy would know most of this stuff, I'm sometimes a little bit doubtful that she would actually have all of this information. Narrator Amy seems to have a much better understanding of the house and its ghosts. And it's true that she may get all of this information as time goes on, but there are the occasional sentences where I'm like, but when did you actually find out about this? I wonder if her connection to the house and ghosts grows over time to the point where she takes on some of their perspectives or memories or other pieces of them that are decidedly not hers, and then maybe they use her as a voice during the story. But I'm just theorizing for fun, and it could just be regular future Amy, which it probably is. It's probably just Amy in the future reflecting on what's happened, but I was just, I was wondering. It seemed like maybe it didn't always add up. Now, these blacked out pages and panels appear frequently enough that it could be annoying to some people if you don't like this sort of thing, but I really liked it. I think it added that extra oomph, that emotional depth that makes you connect to her even more. Yes, it pauses the plot when it happens, but it's like pausing a line drawing to fill it in with some color. I'd rather have a colorful picture than black and white lines, even if it takes a little longer. The remaining issues are similar tonally and have these same aspects. Let's go back to the plot for a little bit, though. In issue 2, the boys have now realized that the house is sentient, and it freaks them the fuck out, as it should. When leaving the house, they run into the cops again, and Rip seems to get arrested while Buzz hides. Meanwhile, Amy is at that tall building, floating outside of it, and she later says that the floating feels like she's having a low-gravity day, as opposed to just flying. Amy now has white ghostly hair, which is normally black. She also has white pupils in her eyes and an eerie glow around her body, which of course signifies that she probably has some kind of powers now. Danny Phantom, anyone?
He's a phantom.
Editor Danny just popping in for a hot second to say, oh my god, that song is still so catchy. I wish I could just put the whole thing in here, but we don't have that kind of time. Anyway, back to the episode.
Danny Phantom.
Amy is trying to retrieve a ghost, or more specifically, a haunted horseshoe, as I mentioned before. And a random, beautiful, successful woman currently has the horseshoe, and since getting it, her life has been utterly perfect. Too perfect. So perfect, in fact, that she absolutely hates how fake it is. But no matter how she tries or what she does, she can't get rid of the damn horseshoe. Amy tries to take it, and we see her ghostly powers come through with some kind of electricity type of thing, and they struggle, and after that, she does eventually get the horseshoe back and brings it to the house. The horseshoe then turns into a more corporeal type of figure with a thin man's body, but the horseshoe instead of the top of his head. It doesn't replace his entire skull, so he still has a creepy smile, but no eyes, ears, or forehead. Spoiler alert here. Spoiler, I'm telling you, this is a spoiler. We later find out that this horseshoe man is actually old James himself, the previous owner of the house. Which is interesting, because if old James isn't the house, then who or what is the house possessed by, if anything? She asks Horseshoe Man James how many more ghosts she has to find, and he holds up 6 fingers. Now, I don't know if this actually meant 6, or if it meant 15, because he's holding up 1 and 5, but either way, there's more to go, and that's exactly what she's been doing by the beginning of issue 3. All of the ghosts that she's after have possessed inanimate objects, which through possession aren't so inanimate anymore. We learn the different ways these objects are tormenting people, which are all pretty creative and sometimes very spooky. And as they return to the house gets stronger. More ghosts inside means a stronger house, I guess. At this point, Amy still doesn't know that her friends have come looking for her, nor does she know that the house has recently committed murder. Housecide? Or would that be if someone killed the house? So is it homicide still if it's a haunted house that did the murdering? Because we don't know if the house is possessed by a former human being or something more paranormal. More questions. Is it housecide? Regardless, Amy has been kept in the dark, so she instead is empathizing with the house and the new/old occupants that she's been bringing back, feeling very connected to these broken and lonely spirits that need her help. She doesn't know what's been going on, so instead of being like, you shouldn't have done that, she's going, how can I continue to help you? Rip is not doing well, though. He didn't actually get arrested, but instead was beat up by that cop. When Buzz goes to find him, he discovers Rip under an overpass hanging out with some street punks who are the, quote, self-appointed punk police. Rip is, of course, ripping a bong. You can't have his name be Rip and not do that joke. And he is high as fuck. And my main note for this whole section that I wrote down in my notes is that it's more meta commentary disguised as a scene. Sometimes I'm funny. Buzz keeps trying to find Amy without Rip's help because he's too high to help, and through him and his research, we, the readers, are able to learn more about the house and what happened. He tells us the tale of Mr. Old James and his tragic life. After his death, there have only been more terrible occurrences, like accidents, murders, suicides, etc. The house is clearly haunted. And Buzz theorizes the following about Amy and the house. He says, "I'm thinking all of these things make up like one big vibe, almost like a sad, angry, confused mind. And then you walk in, and it feels this other sad, angry, confused mind, and it's scared of losing you, so it starts hiding you from us." Now, he thinks it's just hiding her, but actually we know the house has been sending her out on these recovery missions, and it always does it as soon as her friends show up. Eventually, Amy does find out, which we knew would happen eventually because the narration confirms it in advance. There is also a running side plot about some freaky dudes in a van that are kind of sort of government people, like a Black Ops Ghostbusters, who have a pretty unknown goal. I think they were maybe not really necessary to the story at all, but I'm fairly certain they're much more important in Volume 2. However, if the story had ended at just Volume 1, I would have tossed that whole concept. It turns a haunted house story about broken people trying to find other broken people to connect with into a bloated conspiracy drama where people say shit like, "Our collateral damage budget is already in the red." But it is what it is, and maybe I'll be more into it in Volume 2. All this stuff, plus many other things, leads us to a very big finale with Amy going to find one ghost, but then accidentally stumbling on a much worse one that has possessed a videotape, setting up a house versus tape smackdown showdown. Boom, boom, boom. I was gonna say it's like Godzilla versus Kong, but it's actually much more like Pacific Rim, where the big robot Jaeger fights the kaiju alien. Or like Transformers, a house transformer fights a videotape transformer. Yes, that was a much more obvious one. It's this like big old transformers going fighting and boom, 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 and that's kind of how the story ends. But after that, after the fight's over, there is one final scene, which is a little bit set in the future and is clearly a setup for Volume 2. I haven't read it yet, but I have seen the cover of that volume, and I basically know where it's going, or at least where it's starting. I won't reveal too much more here, and I did leave out a lot of details so as to not spoil everything. I didn't want to ruin your whole experience of reading this for the first time. But like I said, I have some really extensive notes, and I wish I could talk about every little thing I noticed, but it's a jam-packed 5 issues. More stuff happens, this is the gist of it, and, you know, I do still want to give you a little bit extra here. I mean, I wanted to give you an idea of what the story is because I don't have the art that I can show you on my side. This is an audio-only podcast. I can't just be like, I'm gonna mind meld the art to your brain so you know how it looks. No, it doesn't work that way. So instead, I'm just much more heavily relying on the plot than I usually would. And we will talk about the art though, but before I get into it, I want to talk about just a few more of my notes just for funsies. Number 1. Old James, the horseshoe man, can give his powers to others sometimes. It manifests as this really cool rock-like exosuit. First we had Megazords, and now we have Power Ranger outfits. Or is it like Pokemon? It's kind of like Pokemon, because it reminds me a little bit of Geodude or Graveler. And I mean, it looks like Pokemon in its appearance. It's more like Power Rangers with how it works, but Pokemon in how it looks. Gotta catch 'em all, haunted things. Number 2, a great line from one of the black pages that reads, "Did you know that houses can lie? I didn't." Ooh, I love that one. That one was great. Number 3, the street punks, aka self-appointed punk police, apparently think they're British and say oi all the time. The author, Dan Waters, is British, so maybe that's why he made that weird choice that was unnecessary. And then I read it and it's oi, oi, oi. And of course, this only made me think of one thing.
My.
Number 4, I feel like there were maybe a lot of references that I didn't get or that went right over my head. Maybe this isn't actually the case, but maybe it is, and everyone reading this is like, clearly that's inspired by XYZ, and you don't get that this thing is cool/funny/notable because of blah blah blah. Even so, I can still appreciate it for what it is and what I got out of it. I feel the nostalgia, even if I can't pinpoint all of it exactly or know every single reference that is ever made in this whole entire series. Number 5, the characters are not all generic in their outfits and design like they can sometimes be in these types of books. The punk aesthetic is complex, and copying and pasting a punk person over and over again so that you have a crowd doesn't really work, so they don't really seem to do that at all. There's punks with punk clothings, and other punks with piercings, and then mohawks and tattoos, and other very Rage Against the Machine attire. It's reminiscent of that time period it's set in, but it also doesn't feel dated either. Like, it doesn't immediately strike me on first glance that this is 90s. It does when you look at it and think about it, and I know that it is, but if you handed this book to someone who never lived in the 90s, like a teenager, and they don't know much about it, I still think they would find it very relatable, which I think will only help with the longevity of the book overall. Number 6. Speaking of outfits and appearances, while hunting for ghosts a la Supernatural, who needs a Chevy Impala when you have a walking haunted house, am I right? Amy seems to change outfits a few times. Now, I like when there are different outfits and a character isn't wearing one thing for the rest of time, like basically every kid's cartoon from the 90s ever, but this implies that she had to go home at some point and pick up some clothes, or maybe even go buy some at a store. It's not like the house ever had teenage girls living in it at any point, a group of them who left behind extra t-shirts or something, nor can it manifest clothing out of thin air, at least not to my knowledge. So logically, Amy had the ability to leave at some point, but chose to come back. We also see her flying by Buzz's room one night, so again, she can leave. My question is, did she have to get permission? Did she go, "Hey house, I could use some more accessories. Can I go home and grab some?" Or did the house simply convince her to trust it enough and that it needed her help and she should come back, and so she promised she would return to help? Another question for my curiosity list. Number 7. I didn't know this was a horror story before I bought it and when I started reading it. So when I first started it, I was actually shocked at the very quick violent turn of events in issue 1. It's kind of hard for comics to be shocking, but when you go in blind and suddenly there's a brutal murder out of nowhere in a story about teenagers and ghosts, I mean, I was goddamn surprised. It was pretty blacked out and kind of censored though, so I wasn't grossed out enough to stop reading, but I was still like, oh damn, we going there, okay. And finally, number 8, this book is very much about mental health and teenagehood. These kids are orphaned, have experienced trauma prior to the story starting, then a fuck ton more trauma as people start dying and shit, and yet Amy still tries to be compassionate. Her experiences with loneliness, rejection, and other capital B big feelings are much more intense due to her age. I am not a teenager anymore, thank God. When I read stuff like this, I think, yeah, that's accurate for a teen to be yearning for more out of life, but it doesn't feel the same way as an adult, at least not to me. You can still have these emotions, but teenage sorrow and angst is not the same when you're no longer a teen. It hits different. But the story has a lot more than just troubled teen being troubled and getting into trouble. There are bigger lessons underneath about the relationships we have with ourselves and others, how to live with trauma that happens to us, and that being fucked up doesn't mean you are unlovable. Shit gets deep, and I'm all for substance in my story, thank you. Okay, art time. Heck yeah, art time. I love the art. And I already know, my descriptions won't do it justice, and to get the best idea of what you'll see, then you should really do like a Google image search of the book or an Amazon Inside the Book preview or something like that. The art is by Casper Wingard, who is incredibly talented and has a very unique style that I like a lot. Like I said at the beginning, we've got lots of surreal color choices going on. The main colors of Volume 1 are probably pink, blue, purple, black, and white. That doesn't mean there's no green, red, yellow, or the rest of the rainbow, but they take more of a backseat to the pinks and the blues. These color choices are very stylized, and that's not to say they don't have their moments of realism, but those moments are chosen very specifically and very carefully. And sometimes from panel to panel, there's almost like this strobe effect that happens, where the background colors jump from like pink to green to yellow and then back to pink. And when I say strobe, I don't mean like a flashing white light. I mean more like a, party light, a colorful light that you would see at a party. It's really dynamic. And this allows things to be separated by perspective and time, so we can better establish who's being talked about, who are they talking to, what are the characters discussing, is this all in the present, is anything changing, and all that jazz. It's really neat, and it does a nice job distracting me from the shortcuts that the artist might be taking. Like, reusing 80% of a panel, yeah, that happens, or just not drawing backgrounds at all for smaller close-ups of people's faces and only using one solid color. I didn't even notice this on my first read-through, I only saw it when I was pouring back through the details, like, hey, wait, is this the same panel like 3 times except one thing changes? And are these other panels completely backgroundless? Like, what? I did not notice it the first time through. That's not to say there's no detail or creativity and there's no backgrounds. That's not what I'm saying. This thing is packed with all of that and more. It's just sometimes they input a few cheat codes and nearly get away with it. Nearly. The art is a really huge draw for the book, and without it, I don't think it would be as good of a story. And when I hand someone the paperback to flip through, the first thing they comment on is, oh wow, the art is so cool. Yes, friend, it is cool. I agree. And like I pointed out earlier, there's some neat tricks in here, like that 2-page house, not quite blueprint thing. There are some tricks to make the gore less gory. When some characters are killed in the first issue, I said you couldn't exactly see all of it, and that's because they go from drawings of people with details to silhouettes, so the yucky stuff is not as visible, but the violence itself still is. I can tell this person is being stabbed because I see the outlines of the weapons, but I don't see the wounds themselves. It's like a shadow, a black silhouette. This isn't always the case. Sometimes you do see it, just a heads up, but sometimes they do these little tricks to make it just not quite as violent and in your face with the ickiness. And I like how the action scenes were done, which can be super hard to draw because, a freaking videotape monster has so many lines because it's made out of the tape inside of the videotape. There's lines everywhere, but it's very well done. One minor gripe I had, though, is that Rip's character art looks a lot like one of the government dudes, to the point where I couldn't tell them apart at first, and it was a little annoying. But if you pay attention to context, then you can probably figure it out, and it's fine. So overall, it's hard to describe the art accurately, but if I were to assign it some adjectives, I would probably say that it's bold, colorful, neon at times, dark at times, detailed when it needs to be, surreal when it needs to be, and very 90s skater punk California. The kind of stuff that might make for really cool graphic t-shirts and colorful merch. I'd buy it. Alright, time to wrap things up. Beyond everything that I've already stated, I chose this book for one more reason. In my hunt for the best of the best comics that I can find and share with you, I wanted to make sure that I was hitting a nice variety. Different publishers, different categories, different genres. I didn't think I was going to have a lot of luck with the horror genre, because as I've mentioned, I'm very easily icked and don't like when there's a lot of blood and gore, and I don't want to read stuff with a bunch of blood and gore in it. And with horror, there's usually plenty of that. But this story was interesting. It was handled differently, and I almost don't even want to call it horror. It's not the first thing that jumps to mind after reading it. In the same interview with the Comic Crush that I mentioned before in 2021, Dan Waters said, and this is a long quote, so bear with me for a moment here. I get labeled as a horror writer, which is fair, but I consider myself a ghost story writer first and foremost. I think ghosts are entirely symbolic of our inner turmoil, and I think it's our brain trying to tell us things. Also, I don't think all ghost stories have to be horror stories. The idea I'm trying to explore is that the haunted house is a metaphor for the human head. Haunted houses are containers full of ghosts, and I think that people are containers full of ghosts. We're all haunted, even by things that aren't necessarily traumas. A lot of the idea of homesick, like the idea of the house that walks, springs from the idea that a lot of ghost stories lately have screwed up the idea of ghosts as trauma. They've become about confronting the ghosts and overcoming them. I don't think that's how trauma works at all. I think you have to learn to walk with your trauma. Oh gosh, long quote. I've cut that down quite a bit, and you should definitely check out the full interview for more of his thoughts from the Comic Crush, but I think it's a much more accurate lens when speaking about my own personal experience while reading the series. I didn't finish the book and think, wow, what a great horror story. Now I love this genre. I read it and thought, wow, what a compelling take on the themes of isolation and loneliness, internal versus external trauma, interpersonal relationships, and mental health. Yes, there are absolutely some gross, gory scenes. No doubt about it, they're there, they exist. And some of it is shock value, but some of it's not. The story is hardship or trauma personified, like with certain ghosts whose bad experiences led them to become literal objects of horror, like Mr. Horseshoe Man James. Or the story is violence as a first resort when it should be the last, but not knowing any better and reacting before thinking. I don't think the house is killing people for shits and giggles because it's so much fun. No, it's trying to protect itself, It's a scared animal trapped in a corner that feels like the only way out is to be as aggressive as possible. Or the story is a teenager who goes through some shit, then goes through some other shit, and some other kinds of shit after that, but is still doing the best she can, even while drowning in negative emotions. It's about connection, it's about how fucking weird life can be. You can be haunted and buried under that weight, or you can be accepting of growth and change. But at the end of the day, it's in your hands. Wow, did this turn into an episode of Mr. Rogers or something? I feel like you're all sat around me in a circle while I teach you life lessons and hand out juice boxes. Fucking hell. It's a beautiful day in the ghostly hood. Goddamn. Maybe I'm reading too much into this. Maybe there's a few metaphors, but it's not quite as intense or heartfelt as I'm making it out to be. But then again, I like my interpretation, so I'm gonna stick with it. Now, I have read a few negative reviews about the series, and by no means am I calling this a perfect story. But a lot of folks have made some sweeping generalizations or very unclear criticisms with no specific examples to back their points, so I've had some trouble finding clear and concise negative aspects that people think. I pointed out a few of my own already, with some cut corners in the art and the whole secret government agency part that I don't love. We also don't get a lot of info on the side characters or even that much of Amy's history in this volume, which could be considered a negative. I think the author is relying a lot more on us empathizing with Amy rather than knowing Amy. It's written so that we understand how she feels and what her motivations are, but I don't know everything there is to know about her and her friends, or the nuclear bastards, or anybody else in the story that may be relevant. I would say that maybe we should have been given more of this info, but it's already so jam-packed that I think it might have actually hurt more than help overall. One criticism I saw, though, was that the characters made seemingly irrational decisions. Like the way the story was written made you not understand how they got from point A to point B. But I totally disagree. If you didn't get it, then you probably won't ever get it, because if you've never been, or never interacted with, people like this, then I can see why it's hard to comprehend. But I personally didn't need any of it to be spelled out for me when I feel that I was given all of the necessary emotional information. A depressed teenager is absolutely going to act this way. Are you kidding me? I've spent a lot of time with teens in my life and in my work, and there is no disbelief in me at all that kids will make these kinds of decisions. And when they seem irrational, sometimes they frickin' are, because teens are reactionary and don't always think everything through or think about all of the consequences when faced with big life moments. I'm not going, oh, why would they do that? That doesn't make sense. Yes, it does. It does make sense. But if you haven't had people like this in your life, then yeah, it wouldn't make sense at all. I get it. But this story isn't really tailored to you specifically then, and you can only bring to the table whatever you've already got. And my one other thing that I really dislike, which every book and movie and TV show and piece of content frickin' ever tends to do, is have the characters be far too quick to accept anything magical or supernatural or abnormal. They never have an extreme enough reaction to any of it. I complained about this in Superman Secret Origin as well. Jimmy was like, oh, cool, an alien who's super strong and can fly? Whatever, let's talk about me. Like, what? Yes, the boys freak out when they leave the house, I'm not saying they don't, and yes, we can assume time has passed and Amy has had time to come to terms with what's going on, but still, I would rather characters overreact than underreact. This is a personal preference, though, and I get that dwelling on it forever means that the story gets bogged down by something that could be moved past much faster. I get it. For the sake of the plot and continuing the story, I understand. I just don't always like it, okay? Okay. Conclusion time! Dun, 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 dun. Did I like this book? Yes, I clearly did enjoy it immensely. Would I recommend it to others? Yes, but you should try to keep both an open mind and keep my prior content warnings in mind as well. Does it deserve a place on my shelf? Yeah, the paperbacks do, and I have all of them, but I'm not totally sure if I want the individual issues or not. Time will tell as I continue to read the remaining volumes. We'll see if I end up getting them, and we'll see if I end up loving the cover art as well. I still think this is one of the best horror books that I can possibly find and recommend that isn't too horror-y. I really thought I wasn't going to review anything in this genre, at least not for quite some time as I work my way up to it, but I think this one really deserved that time and effort to make it into an episode. I liked it. It was great. And if you pick it up, let me know what you think on Twitter at Cactus Comics Co. That is Cactus Comics CO. Let me know, even if you didn't like it. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. Now, I didn't have time for a big end segment today, so instead I'm just going to leave you with a handful of fun facts about Image Comics, which is the publisher of Homesick Pilots, because why not? More lists! Alright, number 1. Behind Marvel and DC, Image Comics is the third largest comic book publishing company as of this recording. There are some other big players out there, so it's always possible they'll get pushed down that list, but for now, they are number 3. Number 2, Image was started by 7 artists who previously worked for Marvel, but they felt that they were undercompensated and unfairly treated, so they started their own company. Quite a few of them had worked on X-Men related titles in the past, so when they left Marvel, some people called it the Exodus. Haha, very clever. Number 3, most Image comics are creator-owned, meaning that the trademark and copyright is wholly owned by the original creator. The Image Comics deal is that the creator receives all revenue, minus print, distribution, warehousing costs, and some overall Image Comics fee. Image creators will get the majority of the profits instead of just getting a preset per-page payment along with a small percentage of royalties. I didn't know that's actually how it worked, so that was interesting. They don't get all of the money at once, though, necessarily, because it can sometimes take months after a comic is released for them to be paid, unless they worked out some kind of not very common upfront deal. But even so, this is still a sought-after partnership that many creators prefer when it comes to publishing their original characters and stories. If you want to write Batman comics, that's one thing. But if you have your own idea that you'd like to get published, then Image or one of the many other indie publishers like Boom Studios or some other smaller companies who will have their own individual contracts, partnering with one of them can sound like a much more worthwhile endeavor. I'm no comic creator, though. This is just how it seems from an outside perspective. I would want to keep the rights to my own things that came out of my brain. And finally, number 4, just for fun, the TV show The Walking Dead was based on an original comic of the same name and has been one of Image's biggest sellers. The series was actually originally drawn in black and white, which I didn't know, but was later republished in color. I'll probably never read it because it's very, very gross, and I've seen a little bit of the show and it's also very gross. The creator of The Walking Dead, Robert Kirkman, also made the comic Invincible about a teenage superhero, which was also turned into a popular show, specifically an animated series on Amazon Prime. And many other Image series have been adapted into other mediums, even like toy lines and merchandise and stuff like that, and there's no doubt they will have many more success stories like these. I would personally love to see an animated series for Homesick Pilots one day. That would be awesome. Alright, that's all for now. As always, thanks so much for listening, and have a good one.